I'm John Batchelor. Gordon Chang of Forbes.com, my colleague and co-host, is traveling. He's in San Diego on the eastern side of the Pacific, and we're very pleased to welcome to the show William Mallard. William is the Deputy Bureau Chief for Reuters. He's in Tokyo on the western side of the Pacific. Gentlemen, I present news from Reuters these days past that the Chinese Parliament, the People's Republic of China, has accused or criticized the Japanese government about the East China Sea and about the cross-claim of the Air Defense Identification Zone. The language was harsh in translation. China says that the Japanese are being reckless and are protesting reckless and risky measures. Their protest is reckless and risky. It's confrontational language. William, a good morning to you. Gordon and I have been following the story very closely since the 23rd. Actually, before that, we know that there's been months and years of conflict over the Senkakus. Your sense, William, the Japanese public, since November 23rd, is this an esoteric matter that doesn't make the evening news, or is this a common source of conversation and conflict in Tokyo? Good morning to you.
Good morning from Tokyo. Thank you. Well, that's a very interesting question, because it does make the daily news. It's front page news. The Senkaku, as the islands are called here, or Diaoyu, as they're called in China. But they're tiny islands. They're uninhabited. No one would be taking a vacation there, for example. But they're on people's mind because, I think, primarily because Prime Minister Abe's government and the media keep it there. It's as you say, there's harsh language on both sides. It's very confrontational. I think it is important it's very important for the Japanese government, partially as a symbol, territorially, and partially because this part of the East China Sea is thought to be oil-rich, rich fishing grounds. But it's also each country staking a claim, as it were. I think the pulse of the general public is that I think in each country, Gordon is an expert on China. He might be able to give the Chinese side better. But I think the Japanese people think this is important, that Japan make this claim. We spoke to some passengers the first day after China had announced this new air defense identification zone. We spoke to passengers who were flying through it, Japanese passengers. And of the people we spoke to, only one expressed fear or concern that the Japanese airlines were going to fly through it and defy China and not report themselves, not identify themselves to China. And yet, all the people we spoke to supported the decision not to recognize this zone. You might think that a passenger would say, "Well, my safety comes first, and the pilot ought to comply with what China says. It's just getting on the radio, after all." But all of the people we spoke to said, "Nope, Japan has to make a point here."
Gordon?
Is there really a shift in opinion here then? Because this would seem to be very different from what the Japanese public would have, how they would have reacted, let's say, 5 years ago, or maybe even 2 years ago. So do you see a shift in opinion, or is something else going on here?
I would say two things on that. The biggest, most notable shift has been political, and that is the rise of Prime Minister Abe, who is much more assertive, he's more nationalistic. He's not. There's not a question of rearming Japan. Japan has a big military already, but he wants to be less apologetic than his predecessors, and that, of course, whether it's justified or not is another matter. But it's going to run into conflict with his neighbors, particularly China and the Koreas, which had a bit of an unhappy experience in World War II. Another thing that has changed is in the past year or so, when the Japanese government nationalized the Senkaku, they bought them from a private family who had owned them. That caused extreme outrage in China, riots, smashing of Japanese-owned factories and car dealerships and so on. That provoked a backlash here, so that I think ordinary Japanese people were pretty angry at China's response to the move on the Senkaku. So I think those things have changed, but I don't think the Japanese psyche has fundamentally shifted. I think I've been in and out of Japan for a quarter of a century, and I think Japanese people have always felt like, heck, those are our rocks, and nobody's going to bully us around.
William, are there doubts about the United States? There's a mutual defense pact, but there's reason to believe that the U.S. is not as fervently opposing China as it once did.
Well, that's a very important issue. In the post-war period, Japan's defense has largely been on autopilot because, we've got 50,000 U.S. troops here, and Washington is our protector. Washington is our treaty ally. If it comes to a shooting war, they are bound to come and help. In the case of the Senkaku, as you know, the U.S. has been very careful on this issue. They don't take a position on whose territory it is. They don't say whether they think it's Japan's or China's, but they recognize that Japan administers these little rocks, and they do say they don't try to hide it or shift from it, but they say that because of our treaty, we will come to Japan's aid. So I don't think we're bound to. I don't think there's any doubt that if it came to a shooting war, and presumably each Tokyo, Beijing, and Washington all fervently hope that doesn't happen, I'm sure, but I don't think there's any doubt that the U.S. military would be there. I think the doubts that are creeping in are how committed is Japan to this alliance over the longer haul. President Obama has talked about a pivot to Asia, but U.S. defense spending is not going to continue to grow as it has, and people here see President Obama anyway as being preoccupied with other matters, and they wonder about the depth of the commitment for the long haul.
Gordon, I hear doubts. What do you hear?
Well, I certainly hear doubts, and there have been doubts that have gone back for a long time, but I think that they have intensified recently, especially with the debacle over Syria. I mean, a number of people in Japan started to ask whether the Obama administration would ask Congress for approval to defend Japan according to the Mutual Defense Treaty, which is really quite a stunning development when you think about it. So I think that essentially there is a reassessment of the American commitment to defend the Japanese islands.
We thank William Mallard. He's the Reuters Deputy Bureau Chief in Tokyo. Gordon Chang of Forbes.com in San Diego. I'm in New York. I'm John Batchelor.